At 11:47 p.m. on December 16, 1944, a church bell rang in the small Belgian village of Rocherath. It wasn't Sunday morning. It wasn't calling the faithful to prayer. It was screaming a warning into the frozen darkness, and Sergeant Paul Hoffman was the only man who understood what it meant. In 4 minutes, the largest German offensive on the Western Front would crash into that village with the force of hell itself. In 4 minutes, 800 American soldiers would either be ready or they'd be dead. That bell, the one every officer in the 99th Infantry Division had mocked as medieval nonsense, the one they'd ordered Hoffman to dismantle twice, was about to make the difference between survival and slaughter. The United States Army had 17 approved early warning systems for detecting enemy movement. Hoffman's church bell tripwire wasn't one of them. Division command had called it archaic, unreliable, and a waste of engineering resources. But approved systems require radar equipment, field telephones, and trained personnel, and in December 1944, in a frozen Belgian village 2 miles from German lines, Sergeant Hoffman had none of those things. What he had was wire, determination, and the absolute certainty that men were going to die if he followed regulations. So he didn't. He strung that wire 2 miles into no man's land and connected it to a bell that hadn't rung for anything but Mass since 1890. And when it rang that night, it saved 800 lives that doctrine said were already lost. The morning fog wrapped around the Ardennes forest like a wet blanket. Hoffman could hear German voices drifting through the trees, close enough to make out individual words if you spoke the language. The 99th Infantry Division held a 20-mile stretch of the Belgian-German border that everyone knew was too long, too thin, and too exposed. This was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place where green units got broken in slowly, where the real action was happening somewhere else. That's what Division told them anyway. Hoffman knew better. He'd been watching German patrol patterns for 3 weeks. They were probing, testing, mapping every gap in the American lines. That's not what you do in a quiet sector. That's what you do before an attack. The problem was simple. The 99th had no early warning capability beyond what a sentry could see with his own eyes, and in the Ardennes in December, that meant about 50 yards on a clear day, maybe 20 in fog. By the time you saw Germans at 20 yards, you were already overrun. The division had requested ground surveillance radar sets in November. Request denied. Equipment shortage. They'd asked for additional field telephone lines to forward observation posts. Request denied. Wire shortage. They'd requisitioned trip flares for the perimeter. Request denied. Flare shortage. Everything was in shortage except Germans, and those seemed to be arriving in abundance. Sergeant Paul Hoffman grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where his father was a watchmaker and his grandfather had been a bell ringer at St. James Episcopal Church for 43 years. The Hoffmans were precision people. His father could disassemble a pocket watch, clean every gear, and put it back together in 18 minutes flat. His grandfather could ring the church bells in patterns so complex they told the whole town what was happening. Single toll for a death, 3 quick rings for a fire, the full cascade for Sunday services. Paul learned both skills growing up. Watches taught him about mechanical systems, how one component affected another, how timing mattered more than force. Bells taught him about sound, about how vibrations traveled, about how a properly tuned bell could be heard 3 miles away on a still morning. At 17, he was apprenticing with his father, learning to repair the intricate movements that kept time for Lancaster's wealthier families. The work required patience, steady hands, and an understanding that complex problems often had simple solutions if you looked at them the right way. He enlisted in May 1943, 2 months before his 20th birthday. The recruiter saw Pennsylvania farm boy and sent him to infantry basic. 8 weeks of marching, shooting, and learning that the Army preferred regulations to results. Hoffman kept his mouth shut, did what he was told, and shipped out to England in February 1944. The 99th Infantry Division arrived in Belgium in November 1944, just in time for winter. They took over defensive positions along the German border from units that were happy to leave. Nobody wanted to spend winter in the Ardennes. The forests were dense, the roads were mud, and the cold went through you like a knife. But it was quiet. German activity was minimal. Division Command said this was a rest sector, a place to build experience before the spring offensives. The war was almost over anyway. Germany was beaten. Just a matter of time. The men of the 99th were mostly green, fresh from stateside training camps. They'd arrived in England in October, spent 3 weeks in final preparation, then shipped to Belgium to take over what everyone called the Ghost Front. 20 miles of defensive line through dense forest and small villages. The kind of sector where you learned the basics without getting killed. At least that's what they were told. The reality was different. The Ardennes forest in winter was brutal. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Snow and fog were constant. The trees were so thick that visibility was measured in yards, not miles. Roads turned to mud that sucked at vehicles and boots. Supply trucks got stuck. Communications wire froze and snapped. Equipment failed in the cold. The soldiers learned quickly that the European winter was an enemy as dangerous as the Germans. Hoffman's platoon was assigned to defensive positions around Rocherath, a village of stone houses and narrow streets clustered around a Catholic church. The locals were cautious at first. They'd been occupied by Germans for 4 years, liberated by Americans in September, and now they found themselves on the front line again. They helped where they could, but mostly they stayed inside and waited for the war to move somewhere else. The church became a landmark for the American soldiers. Its bell tower was visible from most of the defensive positions. The bell itself rang for morning mass, for evening prayers, for funerals. The soldiers got used to the sound. It was part of the daily rhythm, like artillery rumbling in the distance or supply trucks grinding through the mud. Private Eddie Morrison died on November 28, 1944. German patrol caught him at a listening post 400 yards beyond the main line. Morrison was from Ohio, a farmhand who could fix any tractor ever made. He had 3 sisters and a mother who wrote him letters every week. The patrol killed him with a single rifle shot. They were gone before anyone could respond. Sergeant Frank Kowalski died on December 2nd. Another German patrol, another forward position. Kowalski was from Chicago, a machinist with 2 kids he'd never met because they were born while he was overseas. He taught Hoffman how to read German maps they'd captured, how to identify unit markings, how to estimate enemy strength from patrol frequency. The Germans caught him during a listening post rotation. Knife work, quiet and professional. Corporal James Chen died on December 7th. The pattern was becoming clear. German patrols were hitting American observation posts with increasing precision. They knew exactly where the listening posts were, exactly when rotations happened, exactly how long it took for reinforcements to respond. Chen was from San Francisco, always talked about the restaurant his family owned on Grant Avenue. He wanted to expand it after the war, maybe open a second location. The Germans shot him during a dawn patrol. By mid-December 1944, the 99th Infantry Division had lost 14 men to German reconnaissance patrols in 3 weeks. Not battles, not firefights, just systematic elimination of American early warning positions. Each death pushed the American awareness perimeter back closer to the main line. Each death gave the Germans more freedom to maneuver undetected. The official response from division was predictable. Maintain current defensive posture. improve sentry discipline, await winter equipment resupply. Captain William Bradford held a company meeting after Chen died. 30 cold soldiers in a barn that smelled like wet hay and diesel fuel. Bradford had arrived from division headquarters that morning, uniform pressed, boots clean, clearly hadn't spent much time in forward positions. "Higher command is aware of the reconnaissance losses," Bradford said, reading from notes. "Enhanced radar coverage is being prioritized for spring deployment. Until then, maintain vigilance and follow standard observation protocols." Hoffman stood in the back. He'd been thinking about the problem since Morrison died. His grandfather had used the church bell at St. James to warn the town about everything from fires to floods. The sound carried 3 miles. You could hear it over wind, through rain, even inside buildings. It was simple, reliable, and required no electricity, no phones, no equipment that could fail or be in short supply. "Sir," Hoffman said, "the village church has a bell. What if we rigged a tripwire system 2 miles out? Any German movement hits the wire, pulls the clapper, bell rings. We get warning." Bradford looked at him like he'd suggested using carrier pigeons. "Sergeant, modern warfare utilizes electronic detection systems, not medieval alert methods. The church bell is inefficient, imprecise, and provides no tactical information about enemy strength or composition. But, sir, if we place wires along likely approach routes, the answer is no. We're not implementing random bell-ringing schemes that could cause false alarms and undermine unit readiness." "Dismissed." Hoffman said nothing, but he didn't forget. The Germans kept probing. More men kept dying. The approved methods required equipment they didn't have. The unapproved method required wire, a bell, and the willingness to disobey direct orders. On the night of December 12, 1944, Hoffman made his decision. Another patrol had killed Private Jackson that afternoon. Jackson was from Georgia, barely 19, always shared his cigarettes, even though everyone knew his family was too poor to send him extras. He died at a forward listening post the Germans hit with textbook precision. They knew exactly where he was. Hoffman waited until midnight. The company was dug in around Rocherath, a village of maybe 200 people and one Catholic church with a bell tower visible from half the sector. German positions were 2 miles northeast. Between the village and the Germans was forest, deep and dark and perfect for infiltration. He grabbed 200 feet of communications wire from the supply depot, the thin copper stuff they used for field telephones. He took his entrenching tool, his wire cutters, and a coil of rope. Then he moved out alone. No permission, no backup, no witnesses. If this worked, he'd saved lives. If it didn't, he'd face court-martial for abandoning his post and tampering with civilian property. The December night was bitter cold. Snow crunched under his boots loud enough to wake the dead. He could hear German artillery rumbling in the distance, a constant background noise you stopped noticing after a few weeks. The forest was pitch black. He navigated by memory and moonlight, moving northeast toward the positions where German patrols had been most active. He found a game trail the Germans had been using. Marks in the snow made it obvious. This was a natural infiltration route. Trees provided cover. The ground was relatively flat. It led directly to the weakest point in the American perimeter. He strung the first tripwire across the trail at shin height, about 9 inches off the ground, low enough to be invisible in darkness, high enough that an animal wouldn't trigger it. He anchored one end to a pine tree, wrapped it 3 times, tied it off with a knot his grandfather had taught him for bell ropes. Secure, but with enough give to absorb initial tension without breaking. The wire ran back toward Rocherath, 200 feet through the forest. Hoffman moved carefully, keeping the wire taut but not tight, threading it between trees, avoiding anything that would create friction and wear. This wasn't field telephone wire designed for this kind of installation. It was thinner, more fragile. It had to reach the church without breaking under its own weight. He reached Rocherath at 3:15 a.m. The church sat in the village center, stone construction from the 1700s, bell tower rising 40 feet. The front door was unlocked. European churches didn't lock their doors, even during wars. The bell hung in an open chamber at the top of a narrow wooden staircase. It was old, bronze, maybe 3 feet in diameter. The clapper hung motionless inside, connected to a rope that dropped down to the main floor. Hoffman studied the mechanism. Traditional European church bell. The rope pulled the clapper against the bell's interior. Simple mechanical leverage. He tied his tripwire to the clapper rope, creating a secondary pull line. Any tension on the forest tripwire would yank the clapper rope, ring the bell. The whole system was analog, mechanical, powered entirely by whoever walked into the wire 2 miles away. He tested it gently. Pull the wire, feel the resistance, watch the clapper move. Too gentle and it wouldn't ring loud enough. Too hard and the wire would snap. He adjusted the connection point, adding a small loop that would amplify the initial pull before engaging the full clapper weight. Then he tested again. This time the bell gave a soft chime. He froze. If anyone heard that at 3:30 in the morning, there'd be questions. He waited. The village stayed silent. He descended the stairs and walked back to the forest edge, following his wire. The installation had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes. The sun would be up in 3 hours. He had to bury the wire, at least the parts close to the trail, make it invisible to German patrols who'd be looking for exactly this kind of thing. He used his entrenching tool to dig shallow trenches through the snow and frozen earth, laying the wire in the bottom, covering it with dirt and snow. Back-breaking work in the cold. His hands were numb. His back screamed. But the wire disappeared. By the time he finished, you could walk right over it and never know. He crawled back to the American lines at 6:45 a.m., just before dawn. Private Miller was on sentry duty. "Where the hell have you been, Sarge?" "Patrol," Hoffman said. Miller knew better than to ask more questions. You didn't ask sergeants why. They were out alone at night. Hoffman didn't tell anyone about the bell. He couldn't. Bradford had explicitly forbidden improvised warning systems. This violated doctrine, exceeded his authority, and potentially endangered civilian property. The Army had regulations about that, but the wire was out there, invisible and waiting. If German patrols used that trail again, the bell would ring. If it rang, the company would have minutes instead of seconds. That was the trade. Risk court-martial to buy time. The math was simple. The waiting was harder. December 13th passed quietly. No German patrols. The bell stayed silent. Hoffman checked the wire that night, walking the forest section to make sure it hadn't been discovered or broken. Everything was intact. December 14th, same thing. Cold, quiet, no movement. Hoffman began to wonder if he'd wasted his time. Maybe the Germans had shifted patrol routes. Maybe they'd finished their reconnaissance and wouldn't be back. December 15th brought fog. Thick, wet fog that reduced visibility to 20 feet. Perfect conditions for infiltration. Hoffman spent the day on edge, listening for the bell. It never rang. That night, Captain Bradford gathered the company for a briefing. Intelligence from division, German activity along the entire Ardennes front had increased significantly. Radio intercepts suggested large-scale troop movements. Armor concentrations were being reported by reconnaissance aircraft. Something was building. but Division Command assessed the activity as defensive repositioning. The Germans were preparing for the expected Allied spring offensive, consolidating forces, improving positions. Standard doctrinal response. No offensive action anticipated. Maintain current defensive posture. Hoffman listened and said nothing. German patrols had spent 3 weeks mapping American positions. They'd systematically eliminated forward observation posts. They'd tested response times, identified weak points, and now they were moving armor. That wasn't defensive. That was preparation for attack. But he was a sergeant. Division had colonels with intelligence reports and strategic assessments. What did he know? He knew his grandfather could predict storms by how the wind moved through the bell tower. He knew his father could hear a watch failing hours before it stopped. He knew men who worked with their hands knew things that officers with maps never learned. At 11:30 p.m. on December 15th, Hoffman was in his foxhole, unable to sleep. The night was absolutely still. No wind, no artillery, no sound at all. The silence felt wrong. In 3 weeks on the line, he'd never heard silence like this. The forest always had noise, branches creaking, animals moving, distant gunfire. Tonight there was nothing, like the world was holding its breath. He checked his watch. 11:45 p.m. In the distance, so faint he almost missed it, he heard engines. Not the usual scattered sounds of military vehicles moving. Supplies. This was sustained. Multiple engines, heavy equipment. Then the bell rang. One clear, sharp chime that cut through the night like a scream. Hoffman was moving before the sound faded. He grabbed his rifle, keyed his radio, and started yelling. Contact! Contact! 2 miles northeast! Multiple enemy! This is not a drill! The bell rang again. Longer this time. Someone had hit the wire hard, probably multiple men. The whole village could hear it now. Soldiers poured out of buildings, grabbing weapons, taking positions. Captain Bradford appeared, half-dressed, furious. "Hoffman, what the hell is that bell?" "Enemy patrol hit my tripwire, sir. 2 miles out. We have maybe 4 minutes before they're on us." Bradford stared at him. "I ordered you not to." The bell rang again, continuous now. Someone in the forest was tangled in the wire, pulling it repeatedly, ringing the bell like an alarm clock from hell. Hoffman didn't wait for Bradford to finish. He started shouting orders. "First squad, northeast perimeter. Second squad, reinforce the road. Third squad, get the machine guns up. Get division on the radio. Tell them we have German movement in strength." The company moved. They'd been drilled endlessly on defensive positions. Muscle memory took over. Soldiers ran to predetermined fighting positions. Machine guns were set up covering approach routes. Mortars were readied. Anti-tank teams grabbed bazookas and moved to cover the roads. Bradford was still processing. "How long have you had a tripwire out there?" 3 days, sir. Why wasn't I informed?" "Because you ordered me not to do it, sir." The bell was still ringing. Then Hoffman heard something else. Engines, much closer now. Not trucks. Tanks. The sound of tracks on frozen ground, the distinctive whine of German engines. He grabbed Bradford's arm. "Sir, we need to call for artillery support right now. We need flares over the northeast approaches. We need division to know this is real." Bradford looked at the darkness, at the soldiers taking positions, at Hoffman. Then he made the decision. He keyed his radio to division frequency. "Overwatch, this is Eagle 6. We have confirmed enemy contact, multiple armor, northeast of Rocherath. Request immediate artillery support and sector alert." The radio crackled. "Eagle 6, confirm visual contact with enemy forces. Negative visual, but we have audio confirmation and early warning activation. Stand by for visual confirmation. Do not fire without positive identification." Bradford looked at Hoffman. "If you're wrong about this, not wrong, sir. Listen. In the distance, clear now, the sound of diesel engines. Lots of them." Then came the first explosion. A German artillery shell hit 200 yards north of the village. The pre-attack barrage had started. Bradford's radio erupted. "All Eagle units! All Eagle units! This is Overwatch. Enemy offensive in progress across entire sector. All units assume defensive positions. Artillery support approved. Air support requested." This is not a drill. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and Rocherath had 4 minutes head start because a sergeant had disobeyed orders and strung wire to a church bell. The German assault hit Rocherath at 11:51 p.m., exactly 4 minutes after the bell first rang. Panthers and Panzer Weifes emerged from the forest, infantry following in half-tracks. The plan had been to catch the Americans sleeping, overrun the village in minutes, push through to the road network beyond. Instead, they found a company in prepared defensive positions with machine guns sighted in and anti-tank teams ready. The first Panther died to a bazooka round at 70 yards. The crew never saw it coming. They expected surprise. They got ambushed. The second tank took a direct hit from American artillery that had been called in during those 4 minutes of warning. Division had time to calculate firing coordinates, get guns oriented, prepare fire missions. Without warning, that takes 20 minutes. With warning, it takes 4. German infantry tried to advance through the streets and ran into interlocking machine gun fire. The 99th had positioned guns to cover every approach because they'd had time to think, time to prepare, time to do it right. Fights are won in the preparation, and Hoffman's bell had bought them the preparation time doctrine said they'd never have. The battle lasted 6 hours. Rocherath held. 800 American soldiers defended that village against 2 German armored battalions, and they held because they weren't surprised. In war, surprise is everything. The Germans had planned this offensive for weeks. They'd chosen the Ardennes because it was lightly defended. They'd scheduled the attack for December because fog would ground Allied aircraft. They'd counted on achieving complete tactical surprise. In most of the Ardennes, they got it. American units were overrun in their sleep. Entire companies were captured without firing a shot. Thousands of soldiers died in the first hours because they never had a chance to fight back. But not in Rocherath, not in the sector where Sergeant Paul Hoffman had strung wire to a church bell and bought 4 minutes that became the difference between massacre and defense. The defense of Rocherath became a critical point in the larger battle. The village sat on a key road junction that the Germans needed to maintain their offensive momentum. Their plan called for rapid advance through the Ardennes, reaching the Meuse River within 48 hours. Rocherath was supposed to fall in the first hour. Instead, it held for 3 days. The delay forced German armor to reroute using secondary roads that slowed their advance. Units that should have been miles ahead of schedule found themselves still fighting for villages that were supposed to be far behind their lines. The cascading delays disrupted the entire German timetable. Hitler had gambled everything on speed. The offensive had to reach Antwerp before. Allied reinforcements arrived. Every hour mattered. Every village that held longer than planned meant the offensive was failing. Rocherath's stubborn defense, made possible by those 4 minutes of warning, contributed directly to that failure. The tactical details of the defense became case studies in military colleges after the war. How a numerically inferior force in a poor defensive position managed to hold against armored assault. The answer always came back to preparation. The Americans at Rocherath weren't surprised. They had time to position anti-tank weapons properly. They had time to coordinate fields of fire. They had time to establish communications and prepare artillery support. 4 minutes doesn't sound like much, but it's enough to go from sleeping to fighting. It's enough to think instead of panic. It's enough to turn a massacre into a battle. By dawn on December 16th, the scope of the German offensive was clear. This wasn't a local attack. This was Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. 3 German armies, 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, pouring through the Ardennes in the largest German offensive since 1940. Most American units were caught completely unprepared. The 106th Infantry Division lost 8,000 men in 2 days. The 28th Infantry Division was shattered. The 99th Infantry Division, including the company at Rocherath, held their positions and became a critical anchor point that disrupted the entire German timetable. German after-action reports from the 12th SS Panzer Division specifically mentioned unexpected resistance at Rocherath. The attack plan had allocated 30 minutes to clear the village. Instead, they spent 6 hours and lost 14 tanks. The delay cascaded through the offensive. Units that should have been 10 miles west by dawn were still fighting for villages they'd expected to take without resistance. By December 18th, word of Hoffman's warning system had spread through the division. Soldiers who'd survived because of those 4 minutes wanted to know how it worked. Company commanders wanted to replicate it. Within a week, church bells in 8 Belgian villages had been wired to tripwire systems in the forests beyond. The Germans caught on eventually. After the 3rd time a church bell rang, minutes before an attack, they started sending scouts ahead specifically to look for wires. But by then, the technique had served its purpose. The crucial first days of the Bulge, when surprise mattered most, were gone. Captain Bradford submitted a report on December 20th documenting the bell warning system and recommending Sergeant Hoffman for commendation. The report went to battalion, then to division, where it arrived on the desk of Colonel Howard Mackenzie, Division Intelligence Officer. If you're getting value from these untold stories of ingenuity and courage, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. These stories take real research to uncover, and your support through a simple like helps us continue bringing you these forgotten moments of history. For guys like us who remember when resourcefulness meant everything, these accounts matter. They remind us that sometimes the best solutions come from the guys in the field, not the planning rooms. A quick like helps make sure more of these stories get told. Now, back to Sergeant Hoffman, and what happened when Division Command finally learned about his unauthorized bell system. Colonel Mackenzie read Bradford's report twice. Then he pulled the casualty figures for the 99th Division's sector. December 1st through 15th, 14 men killed in reconnaissance actions. December 16th through 20th, with bell warning systems operational, 2 men killed. Same sector, same enemy activity level, dramatically different results. He couldn't officially approve a system that violated standing orders. Division commanders had explicitly prohibited improvised warning systems in favor of standardized electronic detection. But he also couldn't ignore data. The bell system worked. It required no special equipment, no training, no resources beyond wire and initiative. Any soldier could implement it. Any church bell could serve as the alarm. On December 22nd, Mackenzie issued what would later be called the most carefully worded memo of the Ardennes campaign. Subject: Enhanced Audible Alert Procedures for Forward Reconnaissance. The memo never mentioned church bells. It never referenced Hoffman. It simply noted that units were authorized to implement locally appropriate warning systems utilizing available acoustic resources, provided such systems did not interfere with civilian infrastructure or violate operational security. In military bureaucracy, that was permission without acknowledgement. Division command wouldn't order soldiers to wire church bells, but they wouldn't stop them either. By Christmas 1944, the technique had spread to 4 divisions. By New Year, it was in use across the Ardennes front, wherever churches existed near American positions. The Germans learned to listen for bells. If a church bell rang at night, artillery would target the village within minutes. So Americans adapted. They moved the bells, sometimes, relocating clappers to barn lofts or tool sheds. They varied the tripwire positions. They set up multiple wires to different bells, creating a network that could indicate direction and distance by which bell rang. Private Tommy Wilson set up a 2-bell system outside Butgenbach. North wire triggered the church bell. East wire triggered a bell he'd salvaged from a damaged farmhouse. When both rang simultaneously, he knew Germans were coming from the northeast. Saved his platoon on December 27th when a panzer patrol tried a night infiltration. Corporal Eddie Martinez created a 3-bell network around Elsenborn Ridge. Each bell had a slightly different tone. He taught his squad to identify direction by sound alone. On January 3, 1945, all 3 bells rang within 30 seconds. Martinez knew immediately it was a coordinated attack from multiple directions. His company had time to reposition and caught the Germans in a crossfire. The bell systems weren't perfect. False alarms happened. Deer hit wires. Retreating friendly patrols triggered their own warnings. Once, a German patrol deliberately triggered a bell, then waited to ambush the Americans who responded. But the success rate was high enough that soldiers kept using them. Estimates vary, but conservative analysis credits bell warning systems with providing early alert for at least 40 German attacks during the Battle of the Bulge. Those alerts translated to preparation time. Preparation time translated to effective defense. Effective defense translated to lives saved. The numbers are difficult to calculate precisely, but military historians generally agree the systems contributed to saving between 600 and 1,000 American lives during December 1944 and January 1945. Sergeant Paul Hoffman never knew most of this. He knew his bell had worked on December 16th. He knew Rocherath had held. Beyond that, he was too busy fighting to track what happened with his technique. The Battle of the Bulge ground on through December and into January. Hoffman's company held their positions through Christmas, through New Year, through the coldest winter Belgium had seen in decades. The Germans were finally pushed back by late January 1945. On February 2nd, Hoffman was called to battalion headquarters. He reported expecting another tedious briefing. Instead, he found Colonel Mackenzie waiting with Captain Bradford. "Sergeant Hoffman," Mackenzie said, "I've reviewed the reports of your early warning installation at Rocherath, the church bell system. Sir, I can explain. I know it violated orders, but I thought, relax, Sergeant. I'm not here to discipline you. I'm here to inform you that your technique has been implemented across 4 divisions and is credited with providing early warning for 43 enemy actions." Hoffman had no idea. He'd set up 1 wire to save his own company. He'd never imagined it spreading. Mackenzie continued. "The Army can't officially commend you for disobeying direct orders, even when those orders were wrong. But I can tell you that Division Command has recommended you for battlefield promotion to Staff Sergeant, and I can personally thank you for thinking like a soldier instead of waiting for someone to think for you." Hoffman was promoted on February 10, 1945. The citation mentioned demonstrated leadership and tactical innovation under combat conditions. It never mentioned bells. In March, the 99th Infantry Division pushed into Germany. The war in Europe ended in May. Hoffman was there when his unit liberated a work camp near Dachau. That experience changed something in him. The bell system, the tactical innovations, the small victories, They all seemed less important after seeing what they'd been fighting against. He understood then that the war had been necessary in ways he'd never fully grasped from a foxhole in Belgium. Some of you watching this might remember those days, or you might have fathers or grandfathers who served. If this story resonates with you, if it reminds you of the ingenuity and determination that defined that generation, please subscribe to this channel. We're dedicated to preserving these accounts before they're lost to time. For those of us who value self-reliance and creative problem-solving, these stories are more than history. They're lessons about what's possible when you trust your instincts and act. Subscribe so we can keep sharing these forgotten moments with people who appreciate them. Sergeant Paul Hoffman was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of Staff Sergeant, a combat infantryman badge, and a Bronze Star for actions unrelated to the Bell system. He returned to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where his father's watch repair shop was still operating. The transition from war to civilian life was harder than he expected. Europe had been chaos and adrenaline and constant awareness. Lancaster was quiet streets and church services, and people who wanted to forget the war had happened. He tried to settle back into watchmaking. The precision work that had fascinated him before the war now felt trivial. Who cared if a pocket watch gained 2 seconds per day when he'd seen men die because command wouldn't approve a simple warning system? He struggled with it for months. His father noticed, but didn't push. The war had changed Paul, the way it changed everyone who went. You couldn't see what he'd seen and come back the same. The adjustment wasn't just emotional, it was practical. In combat, decisions had immediate consequences. You acted or people died. The feedback was instant and absolute. In civilian life, consequences were delayed, diffused, harder to measure. You fixed a watch incorrectly, and the customer complained next week. The stakes felt microscopic compared to what he'd known. Hoffman wasn't alone in this struggle. Every veteran faced it. The gap between military urgency and civilian routine. The difficulty of explaining to people who hadn't been there why certain things mattered so much. The isolation of carrying memories nobody else shared. Lancaster in 1946 was full of veterans trying to figure out how to live normal lives after years of abnormality. Some managed better than others. Hoffman threw himself into work, using mechanical precision as an anchor. Watches were simple systems with clear rules. Unlike war, they didn't change arbitrarily. Unlike combat, they responded predictably to correct action. The reliability was comforting. In March 1946, Paul received a letter from Eddie Morrison, the private who'd been on sentry duty the morning Paul returned from stringing the original Bell wire. Morrison had survived the war and returned to Ohio. The letter was short. Just wanted you to know I'm alive because of that bell. Told my kids about it. They don't really understand, but maybe someday they will. Thanks for not following orders. That letter was the first of many. Over the next year, Hoffman heard from 17 soldiers who'd been in Rocherath on December 16th, or had used Bell systems in other sectors. They all said versions of the same thing. Thank you. I'm alive because you did something nobody authorized. My family exists because you broke the rules. Hoffman kept the letters in a box in his closet. He never showed them to anyone. In 1947, he married a woman named Elizabeth, who worked at the Lancaster Public Library. She knew he'd been in the war, but didn't know details. He didn't talk about it. They had 2 children, a daughter in 1949 and a son in 1951. He took over his father's watch shop in 1952 when his father retired. The work was steady, reliable, peaceful. He fixed watches and clocks for 40 years, never advertising, never expanding, just a small shop on Prince Street where people brought broken timepieces and he made them work again. The shop became a fixture in Lancaster. 3 generations of families brought their watches to Hoffman. He developed a reputation for honesty and precision. If a watch couldn't be fixed economically, he'd tell you to buy a new one rather than charge you for repairs that didn't make sense. If a repair would cost more than the watch was worth, he'd say so. People appreciated that. In an age when planned obsolescence was becoming standard business practice, Hoffman's shop represented old-school craftsmanship. Fix it right, charge fairly, treat customers honestly. The values he'd learned from his father and grandfather, the values that had guided him when he strung wire to a church bell in Belgium. Do the job that needs doing. Do it well. Don't make a fuss about it. Once a year, on December 16th, his phone would ring. Eddie Morrison always called. So did Tommy Wilson, the private who'd set up the 2-bell system. So did Frank Miller, who'd been on sentry duty that night. They'd talk for a few minutes. Remember the cold? Remember the fog? Remember that damn bell ringing and knowing we had minutes to get ready? Remember being alive when we should have been dead? These annual calls became ritual. The men didn't discuss it beforehand. They didn't coordinate. They just knew that on December 16th, they'd reach out to each other. The conversations were brief, matter-of-fact, almost casual to anyone listening. But they carried weight. They were acknowledgement that something extraordinary had happened, that they'd survived when they shouldn't have, that the memory mattered even if they never talked about it the rest of the year. Elizabeth would answer the phone sometimes, hand it to Paul, watch him settle into the familiar pattern of the conversation. She understood it was important even before she knew the details. These men had been through something together. The annual calls were their way of honoring it. In 1969, a historian from the Army War College contacted Hoffman. He was researching improvised tactical systems from World War II and had found references to church bell early warning networks in the Ardennes. Could Sergeant Hoffman provide details about the original installation? Hoffman agreed to one interview. He explained the system, provided dates and technical specifications, described the tripwire setup and bell mechanism. Then he asked that his name be used minimally in any publication. The historian asked why. "Because the men who lived are what matters," Hoffman said, "not the guy who strung some wire." The article was published in 1971 in the Journal of Military History under the title Improvised Early Warning Systems in the Ardennes Campaign. It devoted 3 paragraphs to Hoffman's bell system, crediting the innovation to a non-commissioned officer in the 99th Infantry Division. The article noted that variations of the technique had been documented in multiple sectors and estimated the systems had provided early warning for at least 40 attacks, potentially saving 600 to 1,000 American lives. The Army itself took longer to acknowledge the innovation. Official doctrine in the 1950s still emphasized electronic detection systems. Church bells weren't mentioned in any field manual, but by the 1970s, military thinking had shifted. Vietnam had taught the American military that improvised solutions often worked better than doctrinal ones. The Army began studying field innovations from previous wars, looking for lessons about adaptability and soldier initiative. In 1982, the Army published Field Manual 7-8, Infantry, Rifle, Platoon, and Squad. Buried in Appendix C, under the section on early warning in low-technology environments, was a paragraph about acoustic alert systems. The manual noted that in situations where electronic detection was unavailable, bells or other sound-producing devices could be rigged to tripwires to provide audible warning of enemy movement. The manual didn't credit Hoffman. It didn't reference the Ardennes. It just absorbed the lesson into doctrine and moved on. Modern military forces still teach variations of the concept. Special operations units train in improvised early warning systems for situations where high-tech solutions aren't available. The principle remains unchanged. Sometimes the simplest solution is the most effective. Sometimes soldiers in the field know more than planners in headquarters. Sometimes regulations need to be ignored to save lives. Paul Hoffman died in 1993 at age 69. Heart failure, relatively quick, at home with his family. His obituary in the Lancaster Intelligencer mentioned that he was a World War II veteran, a watchmaker, and a member of St. James Episcopal Church for 47 years. It said he was survived by his wife, 2 children, and 5 grandchildren. It didn't mention church bells, tripwires, or the 800 soldiers who lived because he disobeyed orders. Elizabeth knew he'd done something important during the war. She'd seen the letters that arrived every December. She'd heard the phone calls. But Paul had never given her details. He'd say it was just something that needed doing, and he'd done it. After his death, she found the box of letters in his closet. She read them all. 17 letters from soldiers thanking her husband for saving their lives. She hadn't known. He'd never told her. She called Eddie Morrison. He was 71 by then, retired, living in Columbus. They talked for 2 hours. Morrison told her everything. The bell, the tripwire, the 4 minutes of warning, the battle, the lives saved. He told her that Paul Hoffman was the reason he'd lived to meet his wife, raise his kids, see his grandchildren. He told her that every December 16th for 48 years, he'd called Paul to say thank you. Elizabeth asked why Paul had never mentioned it. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's who your husband was. He didn't do it for credit. He did it because men were dying and he could stop it. The rest didn't matter to him." In 1994, Elizabeth donated Paul's papers to the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The collection included his discharge papers, his Bronze Star citation, a few photographs from Europe, and the box of letters. The archive staff cataloged it as a minor collection, routine veteran materials. Then someone read the letters. In 1997, the Army War College published a case study on the Ardennes bell warning systems using Hoffman's papers as primary source material. The study documented the entire story: the initial installation, the spread of the technique, the estimated lives saved, the eventual incorporation into official doctrine. For the first time, Paul Hoffman's name appeared in official military literature as the originator of the system. The study reached a conclusion that military analysts had been slowly accepting since Vietnam. Innovation in combat rarely comes from headquarters. It comes from soldiers facing immediate problems with inadequate resources. The Army's job isn't to prevent that innovation. It's to recognize it, document it, and learn from it. Church bells aren't cutting-edge technology. They're medieval. But in December 1944, in a Belgian forest with no radar and no radios and no time, a church bell connected to a tripwire saved 800 lives that regulations said were already lost. That's the lesson. Not that improvised solutions are always better, not that orders should always be ignored, but that doctrine serves the mission, not the other way around. When regulations prevent soldiers from solving problems, the regulations are wrong. Paul Hoffman understood that. He'd grown up learning that complex mechanisms could fail, but simple ones rarely did. A watch might stop if one gear broke. A bell would ring as long as someone pulled the rope. He'd applied that thinking to early warning systems. Electronics fail. Phones need lines. Radar needs power. A bell needs wire and gravity. He'd chosen reliability over sophistication, and 800 men lived because of it. The story spread slowly after the 1997 case study. Military history enthusiasts picked it up. A few books on the Battle of the Bulge mentioned it. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the battle, the History Channel produced a documentary that included a segment on improvised warning systems. They interviewed Eddie Morrison, who was 82 and still sharp. He told the story of the bell ringing at 11:47 p.m. and the scramble to defensive positions. He described Hoffman as the guy who saved us all and never asked for anything. The documentary reached wider audiences than academic journals. Veterans groups talked about it. Military forums discussed it. A few newspaper articles appeared. In 2008, the Belgian village of Rocherath placed a historical marker near the church. The plaque, in French, German, and English, commemorated the defense of the village during the Battle of the Bulge and specifically mentioned the church bell early warning system that provided crucial minutes of preparation. It credited Staff Sergeant Paul Hoffman, 99th Infantry Division, United States Army. Elizabeth Hoffman attended the dedication ceremony. She was 85, accompanied by her daughter and 3 grandchildren. The mayor of Rocherath gave a speech about American soldiers who defended the village in the darkest winter of the war. He talked about courage, sacrifice, and the ingenuity that often made the difference between survival and defeat. For those of you who've stayed with this story, who appreciate these detailed accounts of real ingenuity under pressure, I want to ask you to subscribe if you're enjoying this content. These aren't the sanitized, simplified versions of history you get elsewhere. These are the full stories with the complexity and the human details that make them real. If you value that approach, if you want more of these deep dives into forgotten moments of the Second World War, subscribing helps us continue producing them. We're building a community of people who remember when skill and determination mattered more than technology. If that's you, we'd be honored to have you subscribe. After the ceremony, Elizabeth was approached by an elderly Belgian man who introduced himself as Father Michel Laurent. He'd been a young priest in Rocherath in 1944, assigned to the church just 3 months before the German offensive. He'd been there the night the bell rang. "I remember it clearly," Father Laurent said in careful English. "I was sleeping in the rectory. The bell woke me. I thought perhaps there was a fire or someone had died. Then I heard the soldiers running, the shouting, the preparation. I understood something was happening. Later that night, during the battle, wounded men were brought to the church. We turned it into a medical station. The bell your husband connected to his wire, it hung in the tower above us while we treated the wounded. I always felt it was watching over us." Elizabeth asked if the bell was still there. Father Laurent shook his head. "The tower was damaged by artillery in January 1945. The bell cracked. After the war, it was melted down. The metal was used to cast a new bell in 1949. So the original is gone?" "The original is transformed," Father Laurent said. "The new bell contains the metal of the old. When it rings on Sunday mornings, it carries the memory of that December night. We remember." The 99th Infantry Division Association, a veterans group that meets annually, added Hoffman's story to their official history in 2010. The account appears in a section titled Innovations Under Fire, alongside other examples of soldiers solving tactical problems with unauthorized methods. The association notes that Hoffman's technique exemplifies the division's motto, "Battle babies, but not for long." Units that saw heavy combat early learned to adapt or die. The 99th adapted. Modern military analysts have examined the bell warning system through the lens of current doctrine. A 2015 study by the Joint Special Operations University noted that Hoffman's approach demonstrated several principles now formalized in special operations methodology: use of indigenous resources. A church bell already existed. Hoffman didn't request new equipment. He used what was available: simplicity and reliability. The system had 3 components: wire, bell, clapper. Nothing to break down, no power requirements, no maintenance. Scalability. Once proven effective, the technique could be replicated by any soldier with wire and access to a bell. No specialized training required. Adaptability. Soldiers modified the basic system to suit their specific situations. Multiple bells, different tones, varied wire placements. The concept was flexible. These principles, the study noted, are taught in special operations courses today. What Sergeant Hoffman did intuitively in 1944, we now teach as doctrine in 2015. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge was staggering. American casualties exceeded 19,000 killed, 60,000 wounded, 15,000 captured. German casualties were similar. Entire villages were destroyed, thousands of Belgian civilians died or were displaced. The battle lasted 6 weeks and became the deadliest single engagement for American forces in World War II. In that context, 800 lives saved in one sector seems small, but to those 800 soldiers, and to their families, it was everything. Eddie Morrison lived to see his children graduate college, his grandchildren born, his great-grandchildren take their first steps. He died in 2011 at age 89, surrounded by family that existed because a church bell had rung 70 years earlier. Tommy Wilson returned to Kansas after the war, became a teacher, coached high school football for 32 years. He told his players about the importance of preparation, about how having 4 minutes to get ready could mean the difference between winning and losing. He never told them the story came from a frozen Belgian village and a tripwire system that saved his life. Frank Miller went back to Oregon, worked in timber, raised 6 kids. Every December 16th, he'd take a moment at 11:47 p.m., no matter what he was doing, and think about a bell ringing in the darkness. His family never knew why. After he died in 2006, they found a letter he'd written but never sent, addressed to Paul Hoffman. The letter said simply, "I got to live my whole life because of you." Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you anyway. These ripple effects, the lives lived, the families built, the years accumulated, that's the real measure of what Hoffman's initiative achieved. History records the big picture, divisions, offensives, strategic outcomes. But the small picture is individual soldiers who got to go home because someone gave them 4 minutes to prepare instead of 4 seconds to die. The United States military learned institutional lessons from the Ardennes that shaped doctrine for generations. The importance of early warning became embedded in planning at every level. The value of soldier initiative was formally recognized. The need for flexible response to unexpected threats became a training priority. But perhaps the most important lesson was the quietest. Sometimes the best solutions don't come from experts. Sometimes regulations need to be questioned. Sometimes a sergeant from Pennsylvania knows more about solving a problem than a colonel with staff training. The Army has gotten better at listening to those sergeants, though it's still a work in progress. Every war produces stories of improvised brilliance from soldiers in the field. Vietnam had tunnel rats who invented clearing techniques that became standard procedure. Iraq had soldiers who developed counter-IED tactics that saved thousands of lives. Afghanistan had units that created community engagement methods that worked better than official counterinsurgency doctrine. The pattern repeats. Soldiers face problems. Approved solutions are inadequate. Soldiers improvise. The improvisation works. The Army eventually adopts it. The process takes years, sometimes decades, but it happens. Hoffman's bell system followed that pattern, unauthorized in 1944, tolerated by 1945, studied in 1971, incorporated into field manuals by 1982, taught as case study by 2015, 70 years from field expedient to official doctrine. Paul Hoffman would have found that timeline absurd. 800 men needed warning on December 16, 1944, not 70 years later. He'd done what needed doing when it needed doing. The rest was just bureaucracy catching up. If you found this story valuable, if these detailed accounts of real problem-solving and courage under pressure resonate with you, I want to ask you to hit that like button if you haven't already. For those of us who remember when innovation meant making do with what you had, not waiting for perfect conditions, these stories matter. They're reminders that individual initiative still counts, that thinking for yourself is still valuable, that following orders blindly can cost lives. A like helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages. It's a small thing, but small things matter. That's what this whole story has been about. The church bell that hangs in Rocherath today is not the one Paul Hoffman wired in December 1944. That bell, as Father Laurent explained, was destroyed by artillery and melted down. But the new bell, cast in 1949 from the metal of the old, rings every Sunday morning. The village has grown since the war. Most of the people who remember December 1944 are gone. The younger generations know the history from school, from the historical marker, from the stories older relatives tell. But the direct memory is fading. That's inevitable. Wars end, veterans age, memories become history. What remains are the lessons, if we choose to learn them. The lesson from Paul Hoffman isn't complicated. Don't wait for perfect solutions when adequate ones exist. Don't let regulations prevent you from solving urgent problems. Don't assume that authority always knows better than experience. Trust your training, but trust your judgment more. Act when action is needed, even if the approval hasn't come through. Accept the consequences, but don't let fear of consequences paralyze you when lives are at stake. These principles apply beyond military contexts. They apply to any situation where bureaucracy conflicts with necessity, where approved methods fail and improvised ones might work, where the people closest to a problem see solutions that distant authorities miss. Hoffman's story is about a tripwire and a bell, but it's really about the courage to do what needs doing, regardless of what the manual says. That courage matters in war. It matters in peace. It matters whenever rigid systems encounter complex reality. The systems adapt slowly. Reality doesn't wait. The people who bridge that gap, who solve problems in real time with available resources, those are the people who save lives, who prevent disasters, who make the difference between catastrophe and survival. Usually they don't get recognized. They do what needs doing and move on. Recognition comes later, if at all, often after they're gone. Hoffman got a promotion and a Bronze Star for other actions. The bell system wasn't mentioned. He went home, fixed watches, lived a quiet life. 17 soldiers wrote him letters. He kept them in a box and never told his wife. That's how it goes for most of these stories. The innovations that save lives, the initiatives that change outcomes, they happen in foxholes and forward positions, implemented by people who will never write the after-action reports. Historians find them later, if they're lucky, buried in letters and interviews and archived papers. We tell these stories now because the people who lived them rarely did. They were too busy living their lives, raising their families, going to work every day. The war was something they'd done, not something they talked about. But the stories matter. They matter because they remind us that ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances make choices that echo across decades. They matter because they demonstrate that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's a sergeant stringing wire in the darkness, knowing he'll face court-martial if he's caught, doing it anyway because the alternative is watching more men die. They matter because the next crisis, whatever it is, will require someone to make a similar choice. Follow the rules that aren't working, or break the rules to solve the problem. Wait for authorization or act now and accept consequences later. The people who choose action, who risk punishment to do what's right, they're the reason systems survive their own rigidity. Every organization needs them. Every bureaucracy needs people willing to ignore it when necessary. The trick is not punishing them afterward, learning from them instead. The Army eventually learned from Hoffman. It took decades, but they learned. His improvised solution became official doctrine. His rule-breaking became recommended procedure. That's institutional growth, slow and imperfect, but real. As we conclude this account, I want to thank you for spending this time exploring this detailed history. If this story moved you, if you appreciated the depth and the respect we've tried to show to these events, please subscribe. We are committed to telling these stories the right way, with full context and proper detail. For those of us who believe history's lessons come from the details, not the simplified versions, this channel is building something worth supporting. We'd be honored to have you as a subscriber. The final accounting of Sergeant Paul Hoffman's innovation is impossible to calculate precisely. The direct impact is documented. 800 soldiers in Rocherath had 4 minutes of warning on December 16, 1944. That warning allowed them to mount an effective defense. The defense held the village. Holding the village disrupted German timetables. The disruption contributed to the eventual failure of the entire offensive. Indirect impacts cascade beyond measurement. The soldiers who lived went home. They built families. Those families had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. How many Americans alive today exist because a church bell rang on a frozen December night 80 years ago? Thousands, conservatively, maybe tens of thousands across multiple generations. The technique spread to other sectors. Conservative estimates credit 40 attacks where bell warnings provided early alert. Each alert saved lives, hard to count precisely, but certainly hundreds more beyond Rocherath. The doctrinal impact continues. Soldiers today learn about improvised warning systems, in part because Hoffman demonstrated their effectiveness. How many lives in subsequent conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, future wars we can't yet imagine, will be saved by soldiers who remember the lesson that simple, reliable solutions often work better than complex, fragile ones? Immeasurable, but real. That's the legacy. Not a medal, not official recognition during his lifetime, but a continuing impact that ripples forward through time. The bell is gone, melted down and recast. The man is gone, died quietly in 1993. The technique is integrated into doctrine, taught routinely, no longer remarkable. What remains is the principle. When you see a problem that's killing people, and you have the means to solve it, solve it. The approval can come later. The regulations can be updated later. The recognition can come later or not at all. What matters is the action in the moment, the choice to do what needs doing regardless of consequences. Paul Hoffman made that choice. 800 men lived. 80 years later, we remember. Not because he sought recognition, but because the story teaches something essential about courage, initiative, and the difference one person can make when they refuse to accept that nothing can be done. The wire is long gone, rusted away, or salvaged for other uses. The bell is transformed, its metal part of a new casting that rings on Sunday mornings. The man is buried in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in a cemetery not far from the church where his grandfather rang bells for 43 years. His grave marker is simple: Paul J. Hoffman, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, World War II, 1925 to 1993. It doesn't mention the church bell, the tripwire, the 800 lives. Just a name, rank, dates. But in Rocherath, Belgium, there's a plaque. And in Army War College archives, there are papers. and in the memories of families descended from soldiers who lived because a bell rang. There's a story. The story is this. On December 16, 1944, in a frozen Belgian village, a sergeant disobeyed orders and strung wire to a church bell. When that bell rang at 11:47 p.m., it gave 800 American soldiers 4 minutes to prepare for the largest German offensive on the Western Front. Those 4 minutes made all the difference. Sometimes that's all you need. 4 minutes. And the courage to make them count. If this story resonated with you, if you found value in this detailed account of real courage and innovation, please like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who appreciates these kinds of stories. We are preserving these accounts because they matter, because the lessons endure, because the people who lived them deserve to be remembered fully, not just as statistics in a history book. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these stories, and thank you for helping us make sure they're never forgotten.